Hi there. My name is Jacob Edwards. Uh, I'm going to be doing a project investigating different world building techniques, specifically in fantasy adventure novels that are both very popular in fantasy in the fantasy world and uh, that I personally really like. The questions that I'm trying to keep in mind while I do this project are how do the authors use incredible detail to develop their world? How does their made up world relate to our modern world? If their world is the same as ours, just with fictional or sometimes magical elements added in, how do they develop these worlds within our world in a way that is believable and that could be possibly real in our minds? Um, how do these authors and their worlds compare and contrast to one another? And do these worlds borrow from anything like mythology or something from the past or something like that? Uh, okay, the novels that I'm going to be talking about are the Lord of the Rings series, the Inheritance Cycle, the Harry Potter series, the Percy Jackson series, the Ranger's Apprentice series, the Adventurers Wanted series, the Game of Thrones series, and the Dark Tower series. As far as types of world building go, just based off of these novels that I've looked at, I've been able to somewhat narrow it down into three broad types. There's one where it's completely made up universe, separate from our own, like in a far off land. There's where there's our own, but with something in it that allows them to go to another universe, like a magic portal or something of the sort. And then the third type is just our own world, but with some sort of magical element added to it that kind of creates the sense of like a world within a world, like where, we know that they're in our world, but they're not in our world, for lack of better description. So to start off, I'm going to start with Lord of the Rings. I think that this is one of the most defining fantasy adventure novels of the 20th century. Um, Tolkien really uh, went above and beyond in his description and his world building with this. Um, he said this falls into the category of made up universe separate from our own. Uh, and Tolkien just used very, very vivid description and like incredible detail to build his world, as you know, shown in the size of the books. I mean, they're huge because he was very, very intentional and descriptive in what he was making. And not only that, but he even made up new languages like Elvish and Dwarvish to add just a richer context and uh, make his world, the gold standard for modern day fantasy adventure novels. But as I said, his world doesn't really relate to ours all that much. I guess it has the basic element of human nature, but since the world itself is not our world, then it in my mind it does not uh, relate to ours at all. Um, Keeping with the theme of worlds that are not our own, next is the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. This one is very, very much like Lord of the Rings. Uh, he made up his own lands, his own different groups of people, uh, his own version of Elvish and Dwarvish, and several other languages. And again, just used incredibly vivid descriptions, detail, everything to make his world stand out and to make it his own. And the thing that I really liked about this was that he includes a map in the beginning of every book. So like when as the characters are traveling on their adventure and whatnot, you can follow along with very nicely with what he's describing and where it's going. It's like the characters are going west to X town, and then when then you can look back at the beginning and be like, oh yes, that's how far they're going, or that's where they stopped along the way, or whatever. uh his world also doesn't relate to ours really, just like with Tolkien's world, sadly. But yeah. So next up is the Harry Potter series, which obviously is one of the most popular series of the modern day uh, fantasy adventure novels. This is an example of a story set in the real world that has magical slash added elements to it, with Hogwarts added to it, and several other things throughout the novels. But she went into incredible detail to make this own world within our own world. J.K. Rowling did, and in my mind, she set the one of the new standards for modern day like fantasy adventure novels, with how you can integrate it into our modern world and just create a world within a world. And building off of that is the next one on my list, Percy Jackson, The Olympians. Um, it's very much is like Harry Potter in the sense that it's set in the real world and just magical and added elements to it that help create the world within the world. And you know uh, since it constantly just uses real places that just with added magical elements, it makes it seem like it could very well happen like this one day, or it could be like that. He also uses a lot of detail when describing the setting. Rick Riordan does, uh, despite most of it being set in the modern world. He could have just skated by and probably been like, oh yeah, and now they went to LA, but he took the time to describe how LA was, what the vibe was like, all of this. And in my opinion, by describing these real life places so vividly, uh, it helps make it all the more believable that these magical things could exist within our own world. Uh, like I said before, this book takes place in our modern world mostly, and it utilizes this setting to uh, take the reader on a journey throughout the world that they're familiar with. Uh, but it also adds exotic elements to it by adding in, very mythological places. This is obviously a story that draws heavily from Greek mythology and eventually other mythologies in the many different sequel series that Riordan has written. Um, you know, uh, I will say about this that it does have elements also of where the characters can travel to a world outside their own. They could go from the modern world to, like an alternate dimension or something like that, where, they go to the underworld or they go to Mount Olympus. And it's like they're traveling to a new world almost. But I think mostly that most people can agree that these books are the fall into the set in the real world with magical elements added. Next up on the list is the Ranger's Apprentice series by John Flanagan. This one's one of my personal favorites. It's one that not a lot of people have read probably, but um, it's another story that's not set in our world. But when you're reading through it, and this is another book that has a map in the front of most of the books, I think, you can start to see where it is very much based upon our world, and like the shaping of the different continents, the even the names of some of the places, and the descriptions of the people and cultures in these countries. Like they have they have a country that's supposed to represent Asia, and they have like a desert place that's like the Middle East / Africa a little bit, and even like a northern place that's supposed to represent like Vikings. And yeah, I think that by doing this, it helps connect it to the modern world more than some of these other series that fall into this category, like Lord of the Rings and the Inheritance Cycle. But it's still not set in our world, so like it allows Flanagan to have the freedom he wants to build his own world and still, you know, excuse me, add in all this detail to make it his own, make it very, very detailed. And yeah, uh, there's another series that is probably not as well known, but is one of my personal favorites, is the Adventurers Wanted series. This series is the first example that we have of a world that has a magical element or a magical place in it that transports the character or characters to a whole new world that's completely independent of our own modern world. Um, and this is a unique one because the portal, if you will, uh, is in the shape of a bookshop in our modern world, and uh, there's a sign in the window that only some people can see that says "Adventurers Wanted," and you go into the bookshop, several things happen, and you can go to this other world and go on adventures. And I love the metaphor that this creates. It going into a bookshop and going on adventures, because obviously when you're reading especially fantasy novels like this one, it's like teleporting you to your own world where you're going on this adventure. um the series goes through a lot of detailed descriptions, as the land that is set in just has no limit, it seems, to how big it is. And the author intended this on purpose, and originally his plan was to create a series with at least like 15 books, I think. He ended up cutting it down to 6, I think, because he unfortunately suffered a stroke and couldn't write anymore. But his each novel, you can definitely see how he was doing this very, very slow, intricate world building to build up to what he wanted his world to be, and stuff like that. This book partially takes place in the modern world, but mostly takes place in the other world. Uh, so it's not quite as in our world as Percy Jackson, but it's not completely out of our world like Ranger's Apprentice is. Moving on, the next one that we're going to talk about is obviously a well-known one, Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. This series, as I'm sure you know, is another example of a world that is set completely out of our world. It's very much like Tolkien and all those other series did. They made their own world and created different dialects and types of people and even languages. These just looking at these books, I'm heavily reminded of Tolkien, honestly, because Martin just goes into such detail all the time, and his books are also quite thick, much like the Lord of the Rings books. And as like with all the other ones in this category, it's not set in our world, so it doesn't really relate to it that much. Another series that I just wanted to mention briefly. I haven't personally read it. I've seen the movie, but I haven't read it. It's on my list. But from from what I know of it, the Dark Tower series by Stephen King is one of his most famous works. And it's kind of jumps between our modern world and an alternate world quite a bit. It reminded me a lot of Adventures Wanted. Obviously, it's a very masterful work, I'm sure, because Stephen King wrote it and he's a great author. It's a big series, big books. He put from what I did get to read of the beginning of it when I was looking through it for this project. He just put so much detail into it, and he was able to, as I'm pretty sure he was able to weave a masterful story into set in both the future of our world and an alternate world where that he made himself. So yeah. Now, to compare these books, there are several similarities between different books that I've listed. The one overarching one that all 8 books that I listed have is their respective authors' attention to detail and in-depth description of the worlds they're building. I think to me this is just a sign that when you're building your own world, you can't be lazy. You have to go for it. You have to be overly detailed. You have to basically just literally write it all out for the reader, so that it's as easy as possible for them to follow along and for them to be like, okay, I get this. Not, if it's just like, oh, they're in X town and trying to get to Y town and they go over these plains and stuff like that. It's like, no, you got to go into more detail. And that's what I think not only these fantasy and adventure novels do, but I think all of the ones that I've read do this. So first off, Lord of the Rings, The Inheritance Cycle, Game of Thrones, and Ranger's Apprentice all share in common that their worlds are not set in our own. Uh, while those last 3 were likely influenced at least a little bit by Tolkien's work, to me it's impressive how they each turned out to be unique and incredibly detailed, especially considering they didn't really have a world to model themselves after. Uh, uh, Except, obviously they had Tolkien's world, but they didn't want to, you don't want to make a carbon copy of that. Not only that, but they all just created new languages, which is, I feel like, is very, very hard to do. Just having taken a couple linguistics courses already, it's not an easy thing to do. It's hard to even understand how languages work, let alone make your own. Uh, to me, that just shows a couple things. First, if I'm going to do this and make my own world and stuff like that, it'd be best to map it out physically. And I don't have to include the map necessarily in the book. I could, but map it out physically so that when I'm writing, I can follow the characters along as they are traveling, and add in detail of where they're going, what they're passing through, et cetera, et cetera. Second, if I were to write my own book like this, I'd have to spare no expense when it comes to adding detail in. The more detailed the world, like I said earlier, the easier it is for the reader to follow. So the second comparison I wanted to draw was, between J.K. Rowling's work and Rick Riordan. There's no wondering why these are obviously very, very compared books, and very comparable in my mind. uh, both Harry Potter and Percy Jackson are set in the modern world where the characters go off to a made up part. Harry Potter to Hogwarts, Percy Jackson to Camp Half Blood, uh, where something magical is there. And obviously, that's an oversimplified explanation, but it does have a lot of truth to it. But despite the similarities, they still are different in their own right, and have their own unique distinctions, which is why I think that they are obviously two of the best-selling and most popular children's teens books, fantasy adventure novels in general of the 21st century so far. The remaining two series, Adventures Wanted and The Dark Tower, also had some similarities. Of course, they were the only two that the characters started off in the modern world and were transported to a whole new one. And the other similarity that I really found was that they both contain just fantastic adventures within them. M.L. Foreman and Stephen King really used this to their advantage to create believable worlds and adventures for their characters, and each story is unique and different in their own way. Now, lastly, I just wanted to talk about how I plan to use this in my own writing. I kind of want to do a little bit of what was taught in class with creating a cookbook to follow, but not necessarily follow to a T, of just how to make each of these different types of novels. And for this, I think combining aspects of the different stories will be incredibly beneficial, and there's definitely more research to do if I'm going to make a novel of any of these different types. Like, I obviously can't just base it off of three novels or whatever, but I think all this has been given me sufficient knowledge to create a cookbook of my own for at least a few of the different types. I don't know if I'll ever actually end up writing stories using these different cookbooks. I think that they're still important to have, and to have that knowledge of how they work, because it'll just enhance my appreciation and ability to read and maybe write in these different styles. Thank you for following along. I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, thank you.